Hello and welcome to Freightonomics. Back in house, Anthony Smith.
We're in the studio.
Back in the studio. Feels nice to be here. Also with a new setup.
Yeah.
Got a little new setup going on, make things fresh, change things up a little bit because we need to do that from time to time. But welcome to Freightonomics, where we discuss what's going on in the macroeconomic world and combine that and how that relates to freight and domestic transportation, as well as a little international transportation, because it's all connected here in the global supply chain system. And I'm Zach Strickland, Director of Freight Market Intelligence. With me as always,
Anthony Smith,
Lead Economist. And we got a big show today.
We do. You kind of surprised me with like some econ-esque stuff here.
I actually, this show's going to be more about an education for me, but you're going to help me along this journey. I basically have come to, I was going through the headlines, I was going through a lot of stuff. We live in the age of information, and I just basically got interested in this topic.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it's a very viable, important topic here over the next several months, if not years. Free trade versus protectionism. That is the topic of today's show, and that's.
I love econ too. I find it exciting as well.
It may not sound super incredible and mind-blowing, but we'll break down what those two things are and what they mean, and how they're going to impact, because they're playing more of an important role in logistics and transportation in the domestic United States more than ever in my career.
Yeah.
It's definitely a big hot topic over the last 2 years, and it looks like that's going to continue and persist. So we might as well all get on board and say, okay, what is this that we're dealing with? What's good? What's bad? What do we need to watch out for? So we'll break that down here in a little while. But first, some huge stories. But wait, are you looking at LinkedIn today?
I
Anthony
think
Smith?
so. So I'm going to be looking at my computer monitoring LinkedIn comments here, Facebook as well. But just want to have it pulled up and good to go. So if you want to jump in on the conversation, just give us a shout.
Heck yeah. So huge story, huge news over the weekend. UPS's LTL division, UPS Freight, as it's affectionately called, getting sold off to TFI International, a Canadian logistics company. They're going to take over, and a lot of this is crazy too, because UPS, huge LTL provider in the United States, they sold it for $800 million. That's a discount off the $1.25 billion that they purchased it for way back in 2003, overnight freight. And a lot of union, a lot of labor issues within this division that they're going to have to hash out. They're going to have, TFI is going to handle anything moving forward on the pension fund stuff for the union, and UPS will handle all of the historical, and then that begins once the transaction completes. But what this means for the overall freight market, UPS obviously a huge player in LTL, as well as parcel logistics here over the last year, or several years I should say, and moving forward. And really what's, it's not surprising, I don't think, to anybody in the industry or the space that these two sectors or segments of UPS really did not integrate. And you can find that in Mark Solomon's article on FreightWaves.com. UPS, after a tough 15-year run is going to be sold. And I don't think it's a big shock, because there's a big difference between truckload and LTL, and there's an even bigger difference between LTL and parcel. And to think that they all kind of work along the same lines is huge fallacy of thought. Parcel logistics is deconsolidation on a massive scale. You have a lot more reconsolidation, a lot more distribution networks, a lot more moving parts, almost exponentially more than the LTL sector side, and they just do not necessarily line up, especially when you're talking about the nature of parcel. Parcel doesn't require docks. It doesn't require, a lot of home delivery, a lot of home pickup, a lot of residential area interaction. LTL still largely moves dock to dock, still relies a lot on basic truckload maneuvering, forklifts, things like that. Pallets still dominate LTL. Parcel, not so much. Hence the box trucks.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about a business here. And when we're looking at this space, this is what they typically do. So knowing that the logistics industry is built around margins, I can only imagine trying to hone in those margins and the losses that they must have incurred along the way of really trying to fine tune all of this.
Yeah, yeah, and just think about it as a business that does LTL and parcel. You have two separate docks or separate spaces. Parcel, you don't even have to have a dock.
Right.
You just have to go into, basically walk into the front of an office, pick it up, move it out. You've normally got a little space there, you know, your FedEx and UPS boxes, if you will. They come in, they run in, they pick it up and put it back on their box truck. LTL, totally different. You're still operating largely on 28, 53-foot trucks, 48-foot trucks, et cetera. Docks, forklifts, et cetera. There has to be some sort of warehouse or facility that holds pallets of freight. They're not remotely the same, nor are they really related at all.
Yeah, yeah, very
the only similarity here is that most of the time they do get consolidated and put on a truckload at some point in their journey across the United States or wherever they're going. That's
right.
it.
Right. So yeah, that was a pretty big story coming out. Well, who wrote that? Was that Mark Solomon?
Mark Solomon covered that. Does a fantastic job of covering a lot of the industry news. We'll see how that plays out. UPS Freight didn't make a lot of money. They really didn't put a lot of time and energy into it. Obviously, the parcel segment dominates a lot of their business decision making in that section, and they still have a lot of stuff to hash out in terms of what the customer experience is going to be like. TFI is obviously going to have a role in it, but UPS's transition, it's not just an overnight thing where it's like, okay, now you're TFI's customers, et cetera. There's all these facilities, drivers, docks, things like that they've got to go through and hash that out. So that's not going to happen right away. Now, I'm going to skip over the one I have listed as 2 and go straight to 3 here because I think the 2 one is a better segue into what we're going to talk about today.
Right.
COVID, LA port shutdown.
Yeah.
Did you read this article?
Yeah.
Greg
John
Miller.
Gallagher?
Yeah, Greg Miller writes this, basically saying, the Port of Los Angeles, if it were to shut down due to COVID outbreak, there's over 600 employees that are currently infected or have been exposed in some form or fashion. If this were to shut down right now, it couldn't be worse timing for a lot of the logistics in the United States. You're talking about, ships that are still at anchorage out in the Pacific Ocean waiting to get in. There's container backlogs. There's still a ton of ships backed up and all the way into China. They're working through Lunar New Year to get this backlog cleared out. We've got inventory restocking events that we've covered extensively on all of our FreightWaves TV shows and everything like that. So just the timing couldn't be worse if this were to happen. Now, he does write that he does not think that this is going to happen, but the threat is looming, and 2020 isn't done with us yet, is it?
No, it's 2020 part 2. And really, I mean, this kind of hones into a perfect storm scenario, right? Where you kind of get to see what all the variables that could go wrong, could potentially still go wrong. And really, I think it's a good article written by Greg Miller, kind of outlining what some of the really big headwinds are as we move throughout the year. And it's funny because there are all these massive things happening right now, but to like the average consumer that's just waiting on something coming in, they might not just be like, they're just chilling at home, just like, well, I wonder where everything's at, not knowing the entire storm that's going around. Just kind of facilitating the supply chain.
Yeah, and on the macroeconomic side, I mean, we've already talked about this a little bit in the way that a lot of these shippers and companies have not received their orders that they put 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And if they don't get these orders in a timely fashion or in an expected window, this could have actually damaging economic effects downstream as their order fulfillment process, their order fulfillment cycle gets lengthened to months versus weeks. And they can't make sales if they don't have their inventory. Consumers start to return goods if they don't get enough because there's other options out there, a lot of competition going on. If this were to happen and the flow of goods is stopped in some form or fashion, this could have significant consequences to a lot of companies that rely on a lot of that trans-Pacific trade flow.
And I mean, when we're looking at returns now, there's some companies that are just like, you know what, we'll eat the return, keep the item. And so it's just like, margins are being depleted on both sides. Well, now I don't want this item anymore. Keep the item because we can't handle the return anymore. So it's just an awful storm all around. Right,
yeah. So again, we'll monitor that situation, obviously. Make sure you're tuning in to FreightWaves.com to make sure that you're up to date on all that stuff. Greg Miller does a fantastic job of covering that space along with all the other American shipper folk there. So the next article that I want to highlight, now this is the transition article into what is the larger topic of today. Jones Act support Biden underscores support for Jones Act. Now, the Jones Act basically says anything moving domestically from port to port, that includes the territories of the United States, like Puerto Rico, Guam, et cetera, has to be a U.S. manufactured and manned ship. This is a 100-year-old order, basically says, a Chinese boat cannot be operating, even if it's manned by Americans, cannot be operating between ports in the United States. It was written to, this is an example of a protectionist style law or rule, basically saying, I'm going to keep all of our resources domestically focused on this particular process and industry. It's there for security reasons. We'll outline some of those here a little bit later in the show. But, there's a lot of arguments for it, a lot of arguments against it. I think some of the arguments, for security purpose, et cetera, have been a little bit more prominent here in recent years. I think with a lot of the trade tensions and, political unrest globally, there is an argument to be made there. But along with that comes cost. And certain of our territories, such as Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands and Guam, they get to pay higher costs because of this. And that is basically the quid pro quo in terms of protectionism versus free trade, which is the segue into our larger topic here today.
Yeah, and I have, I don't know if I'm a little bit behind on this, but I have LinkedIn pulled up here.
There we go.
And I just have to give a few shout outs here before we jump in. Rhonda is in there. Clarissa Carver is here. James Fry, good afternoon. We have Ray Gonzalez saying parcel's going to be big since the pandemic came into play. Certainly agree. Mm-hmm. And so, just want to give a quick shout out. But we're looking at protectionism. There are tons of cons. There's a few pros if you're, depending on your mindset, your perspective when you're looking at things. And that's only on I feel like a short-term and localized scale. And so when we're looking at these protectionism, overall, in my economic mind, I see a ton of economic inefficiencies.
Right.
Especially when you put these in place, it's hard to peel them back. I mean, you look at some protectionism. I kind of feel like going on an econ rant right now, but you look at some of the protectionism places that are things that have been put in place. I think most commonly, I always look back to the agriculture first and farmers, and they are needed. They're amazing. They keep America fed. But a lot of times we put some protection acts in place, some subsidies in place that really start to hinder the entire economy for agriculture. I mean, it should never be, now this might not be a completely protectionism thing, but it should never be a better thing to dump out tons of milk because that's going to be the most economically efficient thing because you can't flood the market. So I'm always for free market, let the people decide, and I understand where the initiative is. And it's one of those things where you try to push one button to fix a problem, and the entire board behind you just lights up with all these other errors and issues. Yeah,
so let's back up a step here for our audience and make sure that they understand exactly what we're talking about and go into a little bit more detail on what protectionism is. Protectionism is defined as the theory or practice of shielding a country's domestic industries from foreign competition by taxing imports. Or, there's other regulatory activities that you can have in there as well, just like we were talking about with the Jones Act, basically saying you have to use, through the use of legal means, you have to use a U.S. manned ship and crew to operate between ports. Now, there's all sorts of loopholes and ways to get through that. Some of the article points some of that out. But, in regards to the overall economy, Trump actually was pressing for a lot of protectionist style tariffs here over the last couple of years in what turned into a trade war with China. And this is one of the pitfalls of protectionist actions, is that you escalate tensions between countries and it does threaten the balance of the global economy. Now, again, not trying to take sides in any of this politically or whether or not you agree with it or not, but let's outline some of what the pros of protectionism are. Obviously you've already outlined a few of the cons, but so some of the pros of protectionism: encourages in-house development, less external risk. So you don't have, so a lot of the supply chains have sourcing over in Asia right now. And what are they doing right now? There's the COVID pandemic. So production facilities are at risk. You've got to cross the ocean. Now you've lost control of your transportation costs coming across the ocean. All sorts of variables influencing, your threat to production of your goods coming into and being able to actually sell those goods. So there's a pro of protectionism. It actually keeps more things in house. If you're in a company and you outsource certain segments of your company, you may lose a little bit of control of your process, but you gain a lot of cost effectiveness through that process. So there's a real world example of that. Job growth. You're going to protect your jobs for your country. Obviously, this, in theory, leads to, if more people are employed, they're going to be able to, spend more money in your economy, and therefore it should sustain. Now, I'll let you break down some of the pitfalls of that here in just a minute. Lower volatility. You do not have, once you have control over your sourcing and your materials and your goods, and your employment levels and everything like that, you really don't have a lot of volatility in that sector because you're controlling all of the means of production. Once you have that control, you have less risk, therefore you're able to get in front of the thought of things. One of the obvious trade-offs here is that you don't have the innovation. Yeah. You don't have process improvement with the speed that you would normally have in a purely competitive environment. National security. Pro. You're keeping everything in a country, and you are now able to not have as much outside influence. People are not going to come in and out of your borders. You don't have inferior products. You don't have, Trump was going after Huawei. A lot of that was revolving around the fact that they were, supposedly having access to our information through their microchips. Again, national security is now a little bit more under control, again, in theory, yeah. Under protectionism. Now, consumer protection, there's no regulations. If you build something, I say there's no regulation. There's less regulation over whether or not, you order something, it's produced in China, the quality of goods, not there. They don't have the same quality control assurance that we do here in America, again, in theory. And we've all ordered something from overseas and thought, oh, this isn't what I ordered. And they just don't have the same level of quality control there. And of course, this is probably the only one that actually, and I think you were touching on this a minute ago, safeguarding strategic industries. Agriculture, obviously, one of the most important industries is that feeds our country. In times of crisis or conflict, you want to have as much control of that as possible, especially when you have to cross an ocean yeah. or some sort of border crossings. It's pretty invaluable to make sure that you have enough food to feed your population and sustain throughout.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And we even have Calissa Carver in the comments saying, of course, that I'm oversimplifying, but that Protectionist Act protects our fisheries. So I think that's one of the parts there. That there are definitely aspects of protectionism that are going to protect some of our ecosystems that we have in place, make sure that we're not overfishing, I'm sure, meet certain quotas and all that stuff. But looking at a grand scheme of things, of looking at what does it do to an entire industry, not just like a subsector, and kind of protecting certain industries from any kind of competition more so than protecting, I guess, ecosystems and things like that, which right. is also important. But definitely, I think the first thing that I'm kind of looking at and thinking of is one of the points that you brought up was you control everything internally. So right. when we have that supply chain that's all being controlled internally, that's a huge deal. And so I think that's one of the few pros is that, especially when we're looking at food or things that Americans are consuming, you want to know, okay, is this going to be held to the same level? Because maybe it's not exactly a commodity, because a commodity is going to be a thing that you can replicate time and time again. But some things are variable, Yep. Maybe the food is not quite up to par as to what you want to have within your country. Mm-hmm. And so I can see that definitely being a point. So that's definitely one of the big pros, I think, is like you control certain aspects of your supply chain internally. Yeah,
yeah. And, let's dive into some of these cons, because I think this is where I've whetted your appetite as an economist. The cons of protectionism, obviously, I think a lot of these are obvious to me as I was diving through this and really perusing a lot of the research on it. Your choices are now limited because, say you don't live in America, but you live in Iceland. You don't have access to the same resources in Iceland that you do in the United States. Hot springs, very prevalent in Iceland, great tourist spot from what I hear, but you don't have the access to agricultural means to support your population like you do in the United States. So you're really limiting your availability of resources. You can't go out, you now don't have access to, corn, tomatoes, like they don't have a prayer of growing anything outside of a greenhouse in Iceland, let alone on a mass scale. So protectionist, if you are purely protectionist and isolating, you have to be able to produce a lot of stuff within your own borders.
Yeah.
And even here in America, we can't grow year round every single commodity that we have, produce year round. And certainly having the means of production closer to the resource itself makes it more efficient.
Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful thing about free trade is because one country can produce something, and it might not be that, they might not be a resource-rich country. You look at Japan, one of the top producing countries, but they don't have a lot of internal resources. Singapore, they might produce something that might be more on a service scale, financial scale. They're going to provide a service that they can change on the international market and exchange for goods and other types of commodities to kind of keep them afloat. And so I think when we're looking at this, you bring up a good point of opening up that market because not every country is going to be able to produce everything fully and solely for their people. They could, but not to the point where the people are going to be satisfied and market demand is going to be met fully. And there's going to be tons of inefficiencies, lack of quality, as you mentioned, and just inferior goods, lack of competition to kind of really help and increase any type of actual progress within the marketplace.
Yeah. Now, one aspect of all this, of the cons of protectionism that really I wasn't thinking about until I read through some of the material was protectionism really favors big businesses. Because in the protectionist state, you generally have a few large entities that are able to lobby and have the means to lobby the government, because a lot of what you rely on is controlled by the government regulations. Because they're putting the taxes on the goods coming into the country, either that's raw materials or finished products. So big businesses actually are, and it's kind of funny because in the same line, they basically are trying to say that this actually improves innovation and protects some of those, industry infancy, and it allows people to take less risk as entering a new segment or a market.
Right.
So instead of having to deal with all this competition from around the world, you now have a lot less risk in, starting your own software company, or you're not competing against China anymore. You're only competing, or Japan. You're now just competing with the limited competition in the United States. Well, if somebody's already entered that space, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting into it now. So because that big business is the one that has the lobbying power that's going to maintain these regulations. So in my mind, this is kind of a scary space to enter for small businesses. And small businesses, of course, are really what drives our economy growth.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, that's going to really kind of move the needle for sure when we're looking at small and medium-sized businesses in comparison to the large multi-conglomerates that are throughout the world, especially throughout the country. And definitely going to be leaning towards a lot more resources, as you mentioned, being able to lobby some of those points and really set the game into a point where they're going to be set up nicely to win. I would want to do the same thing if I had the ability to, but that's not necessarily going to be conducive of a lot of efficiencies, or not only efficiencies, but innovation.
Yeah, so innovation, obviously you're going to have lower costs. If you're going to have more efficiency in a free trade environment, that leads to lower costs overall, as well as, obviously increased competition will also help suppress that cost function. So we can go out and afford, all these electronics that we can. You're going to have increased innovation, so you're going to have this constant. It's going to be a very volatile environment. A lot more volatile. Some people like that, some people don't, and that's okay. But at the same time, we're also going to make a lot quicker progress over time. That being said, some of the pure free trade things doesn't mean that we maybe shouldn't look at, not just letting the market run rampant.
Yeah, there's definitely, people are smart, business owners are smart. There's going to be some exploitations whenever possible. And I think even so, Clarissa, Big Rig Barbie, types in again, we certainly don't want xenophobic, but I ideally think our imports of foreign products should be on par with our exports of our domestic goods. That goes without saying, right? I agree somewhat, But I also think even like, so one of the things that even if our imports aren't on the same par of our exports, I think there should be something at every price point to satisfy the overall economy. So if we're looking at, remember back in the day you had a CD player, a Discman?
I'm gonna have to think real hard.
Yeah, before MP3s.
Yeah.
You can get the fancy one with the anti-skip system built in, or you can get the one from the dollar store. I mean, the one from the dollar store might be imported from, Southeast Asia or something like that, and the quality might not be there, but you're praying at that lower price point. And at that point, you can supply someone that has that demand for that price point. They don't want the top of the line fancy one. So I am for, making sure that we have quality goods, but also being sure that there's something at every price point for all the consumers. Just because, as you mentioned, optionality, competition. Really, when businesses compete, the people win.
Yeah. Exactly. And, this goes without saying, but when you have trade tensions between governments and countries, that is not a good thing in general, especially when you're messing with people's money. You can get economic disparity across the globe. You see that within communities when you have too much economic disparity from the very wealthy and affluent to the very poor and impoverished. That creates dissonance, and you cannot sustain that model for very long, as all sorts of conflicts arise. Now, not saying that pure protectionism leads us down that path, but it is in that direction.
Yeah.
Some of these modern day examples of what we're seeing this in, obviously, are the tariffs that we mentioned earlier. Again, going back and forth with China over tariffs, trade war, probably not in our best interest in the long run. But the vaccine distribution, they are now it is starting to become almost a point of contention among European Union countries, as they don't have control of all the means of production, and they now cannot get part of the vaccine supplied to them, and they're buying up and they're starting to hoard things. If countries can't figure out a way to get along, the whole global economy suffers.
Yeah, everyone loses.
Everyone loses in that scenario. You can hoard all the vaccines you want. So what if Liechtenstein is 100% vaccinated if the rest of Europe is not?
Yeah.
You cannot function that way. You do not have the resources you need to sustain your government and your economy. And that's just going to lead to global destabilization. So we have to figure out a way to balance these things.
And that enters a whole other factor, government, right? So I can only imagine if I was a government official and I want my legacy to show or reflect something, how did I respond in these times? And then maybe I want to show that my particular district or state or segment or country outperformed the entire globe, or we responded so quickly, when they might start hoarding or allocating more resources that they might not all need in order to really kind of prop themselves up just to kind of protect that legacy. So I think you're looking at government, that's a whole other variable as well.
So I think the lesson here today is that we should not go towards this isolationist type viewpoint. It doesn't work in the long run, especially in today's connected world. It doesn't mean that there can't be some protectionist policies out there in certain areas, but yeah, I think that's the lesson of today. I learned a lot, especially as a lot of these companies are looking at nearshoring and re-evaluating their supply chains over the next several years to try to de-risk. There definitely needs to be diversification in the supply chain and sourcing right now, and they're definitely looking at that, because you can't have all your eggs in one basket, because what's the use of having it all in one country? If it's going to be in one country, it might as well be in yours. If you're going to do that. So as we're closing up today, again, thanks everybody for watching. Debate topic for today: the Bernie Sanders meme is already tired.
Yes.
Wow, that's a short debate.
Yes.
I said it.
And I was late to the meme as well, because I just remember seeing pictures of it all online, and I'm just like, okay, this is funny. And then the internet just responded in such a massive way, as the internet always does, and blew it up. And I'm seeing other people do the challenge, like they're doing the exact same pose as them.
Here we go. 10 years from now, we're going to be looking back. You remember we were looking at that stupid Bernie meme? No, I still actually love the mittens and the whole thing. I still get a chuckle out of it.
My only wish is that I hope this lasts long enough to October, so someone can be that for Christmas and people actually remember what it is.
Yeah, no, we'll forget it just like we forgot Tiger King.
I remember Tiger King, and he didn't get a pardon.
He didn't get a pardon. He didn't get anything. So, again, thanks everybody for watching. Download the FreightWaves TV app on podcast players everywhere. Look up Freightonomics or Freightcast and get every FreightWaves podcast, such as Great Quarter Guys, What the Truck, Put That Coffee Down, and Drilling Deep. Thanks again. Well,
that was a pretty good one.
Yeah. I felt all right about it. Did you drink your water? Did you drink your water today?
I didn't drink any water today.